Lightning forked across the bruised sky as dawn broke over Cedar Ridge Cemetery, the air thick with rain and the heavy silence of gathered mourners. Cedar Ridge, usually so still, shuddered beneath the weight of collective grief. Umbrellas bowed and flipped in the wind. The townsfolk huddled in clusters, their black coats shining with water, their boots slipping in the mud. But no one's eyes were on the priest. They were all fixed on the 3 horses circling Walter Young's grave. Midnight, a powerful black mare, all muscle and fire, paced in tight arcs closest to the open earth, her hooves slicing mud, rain streaming down her flanks. Copper, a steady chestnut gelding with eyes like burnished pennies, kept close, positioning himself between Midnight and the crowd, his presence a shield. Pearl, the youngest, her gray coat streaked silver in the downpour, trembled and shied, whinnying high and sharp, each sound cutting through the storm. They moved as one, a restless living barrier around the wooden casket. People watched with a mix of awe and unease. Some clutched hands or wiped their eyes, but others edged back, as if uncertain whether these horses brought comfort or a warning. Madison Lane stood just outside the ring, rain plastering her chestnut hair to her cheeks. The new deputy sheriff, barely a year in town, known for her relentless work at the local horse rescue, she felt out of place among the generations-old faces. The horse's eyes kept drifting to her, especially Midnight's, dark and unreadable, burning with something like accusation. A memory pricked at her. Her late mother's gentle hand on the neck of a roan mare, the silent language between horse and woman, a bond Madison had never fully understood until now. A chill ran through her, not from the cold, but from the uncanny certainty that something was happening here that couldn't be explained by logic alone. The priest, his voice barely rising above the storm, recited the final prayers. Thunder crashed as he spoke of Walter Young, the man everyone in Cedar Ridge called a legend. Some whispered he'd been a hero. Others muttered about debts and family disputes. But everyone agreed. He had loved those horses more than his own blood. Suddenly, Midnight stopped dead, ears pinned, nostrils flaring. The crowd's murmurs faltered. Copper snorted, stamping his feet. Pearl skittered sideways, her wide eyes tracking something no human could see. The wind howled, the sky opened, and the rain came harder. As the priest closed his prayer, Midnight threw her head back and reared, slicing the air with her forelegs. Her scream rang out, wild and piercing, echoing off the gravestones. Every mourner froze, spines rigid with dread and wonder. Time itself seemed to pause. The only movement Midnight's mane whipping in the wind, water flying from her hooves, her black form towering above the grave. No one dared step forward. Even the priest took a step back, words dying on his lips. Children pressed against their parents. Phones came out, but even the boldest kept their distance. In that instant, Madison saw something ancient flicker in the mare's eyes. A depth of grief and rage, a question left unanswered, a demand for justice or maybe just understanding. Pearl bolted halfway down the hill before Copper caught her with a nudge and corralled her back to the circle. The horses pressed tighter, shoulder to shoulder, never letting the crowd come near the grave. Madison knelt in the mud, her hand reaching out, palm open, her voice a low murmur lost in the storm. Midnight fixed her with a stare, muscles taut, legs trembling, as if she too was on the edge of breaking. The connection between woman and horse, so fragile, so raw, hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. An old man near the back whispered, "Never seen him act like that, not even when old man Carter died. Maybe they know something we don't." A woman clutched her shawl tighter. "My gran always said a horse that grieves is a horse that remembers." No one moved to fill in the grave. The earth, black and gaping, seemed to swallow the sound of the rain. The crowd waited for something, a sign, a release, an answer. Finally, as the wind eased and the sun made a feeble attempt to break through the clouds, the horses settled, heads lowered, breath steaming in the cold air. But they did not leave. Midnight's eyes never wavered from the grave. Copper's bulk kept the others close. Pearl, still shaking, pressed herself between her elders, seeking comfort, finding none. The townsfolk trickled away, glancing over their shoulders, crossing themselves or whispering prayers. But the story of that morning, of the horses who wouldn't leave, who cried for their lost human, who challenged the storm and the living alike, would ripple through Cedar Ridge long after the last clod of earth fell. And in the center of it all, Madison Lane knew this was just the beginning. Something in her gut twisted, the way it had the night her mother died. The horses were warning them, or begging them, or maybe both. As the last car's headlights disappeared down the lane, Madison stayed by the grave, rain soaking her bones, watching the horses circle. The day would come, she promised herself, when she'd understand what they were trying to say. For now, she could only bear witness, standing alone at the crossroads of grief, mystery, and the first flickers of something far more dangerous stirring beneath the surface of Cedar Ridge. Night clung to Cedar Ridge Cemetery, the storm refusing to let go, long after the mourners had faded away. The ground glistened with puddles and mud. Fresh flowers drooped against gravestones, and the only sound was the distant rumble of thunder. Every so often, the wind would lash through the oaks, making them groan and toss their heavy branches. By now, even the bravest locals had fled to warmth and dry clothes, but the three horses, Midnight, Copper, and Pearl, remained, dark shapes standing sentinel against the restless earth. Madison Lane waited beside them, boots sinking deeper into muck. She pulled her slicker tighter and tried again to coax the horses away from the gravesite. "Come on, girl," she murmured, voice hoarse from the cold and the rawness in her chest. "Let's go home." She shook out a flake of hay, the familiar sweet scent lost to the rain. But Midnight didn't even glance at it. Her gaze was fixed on the mound of fresh earth, body tense, as if braced for something to rise from below. Copper, loyal as ever, pressed his shoulder against Midnight's, his big frame blocking the wind. He snorted softly, sometimes glancing at Madison with a silent plea. But mostly, he watched Midnight for cues. Pearl circled the grave's edge, hooves leaving prints in the sodden grass, mane plastered flat, her whinnies echoing lonely in the storm. The little filly looked so lost that Madison's heart ached, and she found herself stroking Pearl's damp neck, whispering old comfort words she hadn't spoken since her mother passed. It was Mrs. Hollis, the oldest resident in Cedar Ridge, who lingered the longest. She stood by the cemetery gate, her tiny frame dwarfed by a black umbrella. Her eyes, sharp as glass, missed nothing. "If a horse won't leave a grave," she muttered under her breath, "the dead can't rest, and the living best pay heed. Horses know. Always have." She didn't say it loud enough for others to hear, but Madison caught every word, the superstition curling around her thoughts like a fog. As the night dragged on, Madison watched as Midnight pawed at the dirt, each movement filled with restless urgency. The mare's eyes blazed in the light of Madison's headlamp, almost human in their sorrow and suspicion. No matter how many times Madison spoke softly, offered food, or simply waited, the horses would not leave. By midnight, only the moon and the storm bore witness as Madison paced with them, feeling their grief as her own. The world felt very small and very ancient out here. Just the four of them and the dead man no one could truly mourn in peace. Lightning flashed, illuminating a strange scene. 3 horses circling a grave, their bodies shining with rain, muscles rippling beneath coats streaked with mud. Madison felt a shiver chase up her spine. Was it love, loyalty, or something more primal, fear maybe, or anger? The longer she stood watch, the more she sensed an edge to the horse's grief, a warning thrumming beneath it. Dawn struggled to break through storm clouds, painting the cemetery in bruised purples and sickly gold. The air felt heavy with secrets. Madison, exhausted and soaked to the skin, tried one last time to lead the horses away, but they refused to budge. Midnight sidestepped, nostrils flaring. Copper planted himself between Madison and the grave, as if to block her from disturbing something sacred. Pearl finally lay down beside the fresh mound, pressing her delicate face to the earth. As the rain slowed and the world grew quiet, Madison crouched by the grave. In the half-light, she noticed deep hoofprints all around. The earth churned and unsettled, as if the horses had been digging through the night. Something about the pattern made her uneasy. It was almost as though they were trying to uncover or protect something buried deeper than just a casket. She glanced up to see old Mrs. Hollis still lingering at the gate, her face drawn with worry. "You see now?" the old woman called out, voice carrying across the wet grass. "They're telling us something's wrong. I'd listen, girl, before it's too late." That thought rooted itself in Madison's mind. Why were these horses so obsessed? Had they sensed some threat at the funeral, something no human had seen? Or was this just the depth of their devotion, a grief too big for words or even tears? Other questions followed, dark and insistent. Why had Walter Young's family seemed so quick to leave, barely shedding a tear? Why had the horses reacted so violently to the coffin being lowered? Madison shook her head, trying to clear the fog. Maybe she was reading too much into it, but her gut said otherwise. By mid-morning, the storm finally broke. The cemetery was deserted except for Madison and the 3 horses, still standing vigil. Realizing she couldn't leave them out here, not after everything, Madison made a decision. She called the rescue, arranged a trailer, and gently, patiently loaded Midnight, Copper, and Pearl inside. Midnight balked at the ramp, but, after a tense moment, followed Madison's lead, her trust hard-won in the small hours of the storm. Driving back to her rescue stable, Madison's mind raced. She felt a responsibility settle on her shoulders, not just for the horses' safety, but for whatever story was unfolding around Walter Young's grave. She'd always believed in the power of intuition, the silent wisdom animals carried. And this time, the horses were crying out in a language that demanded to be understood. When she finally pulled into the stable yard, the clouds were thinning, light breaking through. The townspeople might whisper, might even think her foolish for bringing 3 grieving horses home. But Madison didn't care. She watched them step from the trailer, Midnight first, head high and unyielding. Copper close behind, eyes wary. Pearl, the last, delicate and shivering. Madison led them into stalls, laid out fresh hay, clean water, and soft bedding. But Midnight refused food, standing with her nose pressed to the stall door, still staring toward the cemetery, as if she could see all the way through the hills and rain. Madison sat with them as the sun rose, exhaustion tugging at her bones. She knew this was only the beginning. The hoofprints, the restless circling, the old woman's words, and the ache in her own heart had all pointed toward something unfinished, something that would not be buried. As she dozed, half awake, Madison promised the horses, and herself, she would not let this go. Whatever was haunting Cedar Ridge had not ended with Walter Young's death. If the horses could not rest, neither would she. And far beyond the stable, a new day was beginning in Cedar Ridge, but some shadows refused to lift. Morning at Cedar Ridge Horse Rescue arrived on a tide of fog and lingering sorrow. The storm had washed the world clean, but inside Madison's barn, a deeper gloom remained, thick and unmoving. The stalls were quiet except for the sound of Midnight's hooves shifting restlessly on the straw, the occasional thump echoing against the old wooden boards. It was a sound that spoke of a wound far older than yesterday's storm. Madison moved quietly from stall to stall, checking water buckets, laying out fresh hay. She paused at Midnight's door, watching the black mare stand with her head drooping, eyes fixed somewhere only she could see. The rain had left streaks on her coat, and her mane hung in wet ropes. But it was the look of exhaustion, of sleepless, restless grieving that caught Madison most. She opened the stall and stepped inside, careful not to spook her. Copper and Pearl were in the adjacent stalls, separated by only half walls and open slats. Pearl nickered softly, pressing her nose through the gap to nuzzle Midnight's side, but the older mare barely acknowledged her. Copper, solid and patient, watched Madison with solemn brown eyes, shifting only when Pearl became too insistent. The herd's sorrow was a living thing, filling the barn with a weight Madison felt in her bones. She set down a flake of sweet grass hay at Midnight's feet, but the mare ignored it. Madison reached for the brush and began to stroke Midnight's neck in slow, even motions. The silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat and the faint trembling in her voice as she spoke. "You know," she murmured, "when I was 10, my mom died." Her words hung in the air, strange and almost foreign to her own ears. She used to say horses remember everything, every kindness, every hurt. Sometimes I think that's why we understand each other. Midnight flicked an ear, but didn't turn. Madison took a deep breath and continued, voice steadier now. "I couldn't eat or sleep for days after. My world just stopped. You know what that feels like, don't you?" Midnight's flanks shuddered. Slowly, she shifted her weight, turning her head just enough to meet Madison's eyes. For a long moment, neither moved. Madison remembered watching her mother's favorite mare refuse food for a week after the funeral, standing sentinel at the gate, as if waiting for someone who would never return. "You're not alone," Madison whispered. "I promise." As dusk crept through the slats in the barn, Madison brought a pail of warm mash, hoping the scent might tempt the mare. She noticed, as she set it down, a dark stain along Midnight's shoulder, fresh, glistening red against black hair. Madison's breath caught. Carefully, she parted the hair and found a shallow gash, still oozing, the edges raw. It was too recent to have happened at the funeral. Madison's mind raced. Had someone tried to restrain Midnight? Had the mare struggled at the grave? Or was there something more sinister? She dabbed the wound gently, the mare flinching but not lashing out. The trust in that moment, Midnight allowing Madison's touch, accepting her care, felt like a tiny miracle. Copper and Pearl watched in silence, their own bodies pressed close to the walls as if forming a protective barrier around the grieving leader. After treating Midnight's shoulder, Madison settled on an old stool outside the stall, fatigue dragging at her limbs. She reached for the stack of papers she'd taken from the sheriff's office, Walter Young's will and last wishes. She'd promised herself she'd review them, partly out of duty, partly out of curiosity. As she flipped through the thick legalese, her eyes snagged on a clause buried halfway down the page. All property, assets, and remaining livestock to be left in trust for the benefit of Midnight, Copper, and Pearl, in the care of Madison Lane or such person deemed fit by the court. My estranged family shall have no claim unless proven worthy in a court of law. Madison blinked, stunned. Walter had left everything to the horses, not to his children or siblings, who had all but stormed from the funeral, muttering about debts and betrayals, but to these 3 animals, and by extension, to her care. It was a choice guaranteed to stir up anger, jealousy, maybe even danger. She thought back to the tense faces at the funeral, the way certain family members had glared at the horses, at her. The will would change everything. She closed her eyes, leaning her head against the stall door, letting the barn's quiet surround her. Above, rainwater dripped from the eaves, marking time with slow, steady drops. The horses shifted and sighed. Pearl finally settled down in her straw, head tucked under Copper's chin. Madison found herself telling midnight stories about her mother, about the time she'd snuck out in a thunderstorm to comfort a frightened foal, about the long walks through cedar woods, about the way she'd always known when a horse was in pain before anyone else. "I used to think I'd never get over losing her," Madison said, voice barely more than a breath. "But somehow, you find ways to keep going. You find new people, or animals, or maybe you just learn to live with the empty space." Midnight's ears flicked. For the first time, she stretched her neck forward and let Madison's hand rest on her forehead, just above the eyes. The mare's breath came slow and deep. Madison felt the wall between them ease, just a little. Night deepened, settling heavy on the barn. Madison sat until her legs went numb, afraid to leave, afraid to break the fragile connection she'd found with Midnight. She watched the horses drift in and out of uneasy sleep, eyes fluttering, legs twitching as if chasing memories in their dreams. As she finally rose to leave, she glanced at Walter's will again, the weight of responsibility sinking in. Protect the horses, protect the legacy, find out what really happened. She switched off the lights, pausing at the barn door to look back. Midnight stood, finally at rest. Copper and Pearl curled beside her. For the first time since the funeral, the mare's eyes closed, trust flickering to life in the shadowed quiet. In the morning, Madison knew there would be more questions. Why was Midnight wounded? Why had Walter left everything to the horses? What secrets were the townsfolk hiding? But for tonight, in the hush of the barn, there was the faintest glimmer of hope, proof that even the deepest grief could begin to heal. And in the silence, Madison promised herself, whatever darkness haunted Cedar Ridge, she would not let it take these horses, not while she still drew breath. The wind had finally died down over Cedar Ridge, but Madison Lane's mind was a storm of its own. Sleep came in scraps, uneasy and filled with fractured memories, her mother's laughter, the flash of a dark horse in moonlight, Walter Young's stern, kind face. By morning, she was already in the kitchen, coffee cup clutched tight, staring at the barn beyond the frosted window. Today, she knew, meant questions. Questions for the living as much as for the dead. She started her rounds with Midnight. The black mare greeted her with a weary nicker, softer now, her eyes holding a flicker of trust. Copper and Pearl watched from their stalls, pressed close together. There was a hush in the barn, a sense of waiting, like everyone was holding their breath. Madison spent the morning making calls. She needed answers, and that meant reaching out to the men and women who'd known Walter Young best. Old cowboys, stable hands, the few friends he'd trusted. She scribbled notes as she dialed, piecing together fragments of a life now tangled up with hers. It was Mr. Ames, the retired ranch foreman, who agreed to meet first. He sat on the porch of his weathered cottage, blanket across his knees, eyes sharp as ever beneath his battered hat. Madison poured them both coffee and cut straight to it. "Tell me about Walter. And about midnight, Copper and Pearl. Ames chuckled, voice rough as gravel. Walter didn't have much use for most folks, but those horses. He'd walk through a blizzard for them. In fact, he did. 5 winters back, the big freeze. Town was shut down, roads iced over. Most folks wouldn't dare go out, but Walter loaded up a sled with hay and grain and walked 10 miles to the north pasture. Saved 'em from starving, he did. He sipped his coffee, eyes distant. Always said he owed 'em more than they owed him. Madison jotted notes, mind racing. And his family? Ames snorted. Never saw a more bitter bunch. Didn't come around unless they wanted something. After that blizzard, Walter stopped letting 'em near the ranch. Said he'd rather trust the horses. They talked for an hour. More stories came. How Walter built the barn with his own hands. How Midnight was born the night his wife died. How the town's children used to feed apples to Pearl at the fair. The more Madison listened, the more her guilt grew. She'd wanted to believe there was something sinister, but all she heard was kindness and the weight of old hurts. Still, the questions gnawed at her. Why the violence at the grave? Why leave everything to the horses, not his own flesh and blood? After leaving Ames's porch, Madison drove out to Walter's now empty ranch. The house stood silent, windows boarded, the paint peeled by years of wind and sun. She'd brought Midnight with her in the trailer, hoping the familiar scents might comfort the mare. Instead, as they pulled up, Midnight balked, ears pinned, refusing to step out. Madison coaxed and pleaded, but the horse only stared at the sagging front door, muscles trembling. Copper whinnied from the trailer, a low, anxious sound. Pearl stomped nervously, her nostrils wide, breath steaming in the morning chill. Madison watched them, her heart heavy. She knew horses carried memories just as people did, but the intensity in their eyes, especially Midnight's, was almost more than she could bear. Taking a deep breath, Madison walked up to the porch, pushing open the creaking screen door. The house smelled of dust, old leather, and a hint of tobacco. Sunlight pooled on faded rugs and photographs that lined the walls. Walter as a young man, grinning beside a mare that could have been Midnight's mother. Children on ponies at the county fair. Madison wandered the rooms, searching for anything that felt like a clue. In the living room, tucked behind a stack of horse magazines, she found a faded photograph, edges curled, colors nearly gone. Walter, a little younger, stood with Midnight, Copper, and Pearl outside a barn she didn't recognize. It wasn't the main barn. This one was smaller, overgrown with wild roses, tucked into what looked like a grove of cedars. She frowned, turning the photo over. On the back, in Walter's tight, angular script, Where the Secrets Sleep, 2008. Madison's pulse quickened. She'd lived in Cedar Ridge for a year, thought she knew every barn and shed within 5 miles. But this place, where was it? Why wasn't it listed in the county records? She pocketed the photo and stepped back outside. Midnight watched from the trailer ramp, ears forward, tense as a wire. Madison walked over, holding out her hand. "You remember this place, don't you, girl?" Midnight hesitated, then stretched out her neck, her breath hot on Madison's palm. Madison led her a little closer to the ranch gate, but Midnight balked again, eyes fixed on the empty house. It was as if she sensed a presence, or a memory, she couldn't face. Copper and Pearl shuffled behind her, refusing to go further. Madison let them be. She took out her phone, snapping pictures of the house, the barn, the fields. Somewhere, she was sure, there was a piece of this puzzle she'd missed. If Walter had hidden something, money, evidence, even just a memory, She owed it to him and to these horses to find it. She drove back to the rescue with the photo burning a hole in her pocket. All the way home, Midnight stared out the window, her body rigid, never relaxing. Madison's guilt deepened. Was she chasing shadows? Or was there truly something dangerous at the heart of this family tragedy? Back at the barn, Madison pinned the faded photograph to her office corkboard, tracing Walter's face with her finger. She replayed the stories she'd heard, the ache in Mr. Ames's voice, the way the horses refused to cross the threshold of Walter's home. She thought of her mother, how she'd always said, "Trust the ones who can't lie, Madison. Horses, dogs, little kids. They'll tell you the truth if you listen." She stared out at the paddock, where Midnight stood by the fence, Copper and Pearl pressed close. For a moment, she saw herself through the horse's eyes. A stranger, maybe an ally. Maybe just another wounded soul looking for meaning in a world that made too little sense. Madison sank down on the porch steps, head in her hands, letting the day's confusion and sorrow wash over her. The horses' shapes moved against the twilight, silent and solemn, holding their own counsel beneath the wide Texas sky. There was one truth Madison couldn't ignore. These horses knew more than they could show. And somewhere, in a forgotten barn, in old wounds and older secrets, was the answer. And she swore, as the night gathered, she would find it, no matter the cost. Rain returned to Cedar Ridge in the dead of night, hard and cold and relentless, drumming against the tin roofs and filling the air with a sense of urgency. Madison Lane jerked awake in her trailer, heart pounding, the echo of hooves and frantic cries still ringing in her ears. She'd been dreaming of the cemetery, of black shapes pawing at the earth, of voices calling her name from beneath the sod. When her phone buzzed with a call from her stable hand, she was already halfway into her boots. "They're gone," the voice on the line said, breathless, panicked. Madison, the horses, Midnight, Copper, Pearl, they broke through the paddock, the gates hanging wide and the tracks lead straight back to the cemetery. Madison's blood ran cold. She grabbed her raincoat and flashlight, then jumped in her pickup, barely noticing the slickness of the road as she tore through the empty streets. Her mind spun with 100 possibilities. Were the horses searching for Walter, or fleeing from something only they could sense? Were they just wild with grief, or was there a purpose to their midnight escape? She reached Cedar Ridge Cemetery as the rain hammered down, headlights slicing through the dark. The familiar iron gates were ajar, their hinges squealing in protest. Madison pulled in, heart sinking at the sight before her. Midnight, Copper, and Pearl were clustered around Walter Young's grave, their bodies tense and slick with rain, hooves churning the earth in a frenzy. Midnight reared and pawed at the fresh dirt, her breath visible in the cold, nostrils flaring with exertion and fear. Copper pressed against her, muscles bunching as he dug at the sodden mound, his massive frame throwing mud high into the air. Pearl darted in and out, shrieking every time thunder cracked above, but always returning to the edge of the pit, desperate and wild-eyed. Madison leapt from the truck and ran, slipping in the mud as she approached. "Easy, easy now, stop!" she shouted, waving her arms, but the horses barely seemed to hear her. They were possessed, each movement filled with an urgency that cut her to the bone. The rain poured off her face, soaking her to the skin, but she pressed forward, heart pounding. A small crowd was beginning to gather at the edge of the cemetery, drawn by the headlights and the commotion. Neighbors, townsfolk, people who'd been at the funeral, all watched in shock and fear as the horses tore at the grave. "Get them out of here!" someone yelled, but Madison ignored them. She saw something else. Blood streaking down Midnight's legs, raw wounds on Copper's flanks, Pearl's sides heaving as she tried to dig with her hooves. "Stop, please!" Madison's voice cracked as she tried to reach Midnight, slipping and falling in the churned-up earth. She crawled closer, grabbing for the mare's bridle, feeling the animal's panic and pain course through her own body. For a moment, the storm faded. The world shrank to just her and Midnight, the bond between them taut as wire. "Come on, girl. I know it hurts. I know you're scared. But I need you to trust me." Madison pressed her forehead to Midnight's, both of them trembling in the rain. At last, Midnight hesitated, sides shuddering, legs giving out. The mare collapsed to her knees, head dropping, blood mixing with mud. Madison sobbed in relief and despair, wrapping her arms around the horse's neck. Pearl shrieked and bolted as a pair of men tried to approach, slipping in the mud, her cries high and broken. Copper blocked the bystanders, baring his teeth, protecting Midnight as if his own life depended on it. The townsfolk began to argue, their fear boiling over. "Something's wrong," old Mrs. Hollis cried, wringing her hands. "This ain't natural. They're trying to tell us something's not right." Madison glanced at the grave, where the horses had dug a deep trench, nearly reaching the coffin's lid. The earth was churned and torn, the edges of the box peeking through the mud. A chill swept over her. She felt it in her bones, a certainty that this was no ordinary grief. Suddenly, Copper struck the coffin with his hoof. The wood split with a crack. Pearl screamed again, echoing the sound, and the crowd fell silent. Madison, heart pounding, dropped to her knees and clawed at the broken lid, hands numb with cold and dread. With help from a few brave neighbors, they wrenched the lid free. The coffin was empty. For a moment, no one moved. The storm seemed to hold its breath, the world pausing at the edge of something terrible. Madison stared into the void, rain filling the coffin, her own reflection wavering in the black water. "Where is he?" a woman whispered, backing away. "Where's Walter?" Panic erupted. Some shouted for police. Others accused Madison, or the family, or the funeral home. Theories flew. Walter had never died. Someone had stolen the body. The whole thing was a trick. Madison tuned it all out, her mind racing through every detail she'd missed. The horses had known. They'd sensed it from the start. The empty grave, the unfinished business. As the crowd surged and the rain hammered down, Madison felt Copper press against her side, steadying her. Pearl huddled beside Midnight, who lay trembling in the mud, eyes glazed and unfocused. Madison wiped the rain from her face and looked around, searching for meaning in the chaos. She caught Mrs. Hollis's eye. The old woman nodded, grim and certain. "Find the truth, child. The dead don't walk away on their own." For a long moment, Madison knelt in the mud, hand on Midnight's mane, heart aching with grief and dread. She realized the storm inside her was just beginning. Whatever secrets haunted Cedar Ridge, they were clawing their way to the surface, and now the whole town was watching. Somewhere out there, Walter Young was missing. The horses were bleeding for answers, and Madison Lane swore she wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth, even if it meant risking everything she had left. As dawn broke, painting the cemetery in a harsh gray light, the three horses pressed close together, battered but unbroken, and Madison stood beside them. No longer just a rescuer, but a guardian of the story only they could tell. The news that Walter Young's coffin was empty spread through Cedar Ridge faster than wildfire. By noon, the cemetery was crawling with police, reporters, and townsfolk hungry for gossip or answers, sometimes both. Madison Lane watched the commotion from the shadow of an oak, mud still caked on her jeans, rainwater dripping from her hair. Midnight, Copper and Pearl stood in the rescue's trailer, bandaged and exhausted, their ordeal written across every muscle and tremor. The authorities wanted explanations. The young family wanted someone to blame. Madison wanted only the truth, but she knew she'd have to dig for it herself. The faded photograph from Walter's house burned in her pocket. Walter standing beside midnight Copper and Pearl in front of a barn choked by wild roses and cedars. The inscription on the back, "Where the Secrets Sleep, 2008, echoed in her mind. That afternoon, after tending to the horses' wounds and double-checking every stall and gate, Madison gathered her courage. She took a copy of the old photo and a flashlight, then opened the rescue's main gate. The storm had left the world sodden and new, the woods at the edge of town lush and tangled with fresh growth. Midnight caught her eye as Madison loaded her tack bag into the pickup. Something in the mare's posture, head raised, ears forward, said, "Take me." On impulse, Madison led Midnight into the trailer. Copper nickered, restless, but stayed back, his side pressed against Pearl, who was limping from the frantic night before. Madison stroked their necks, promising to return soon, then headed out. The back roads twisted through old pastures and dense trees, every mile familiar and yet suddenly filled with possibility. The directions in Walter's photograph were vague: a landmark barn, a stand of old cedars, a winding stream. Madison followed her instincts, turning off the paved road onto a rutted track half hidden by weeds and branches. Midnight paced in the trailer, hooves clattering as if she recognized the route. At the end of the track, where a thicket of wild roses spilled into the lane, Madison stopped and stepped out. The world was hushed, the air heavy with the scent of rain and flowers. The only sound, the buzz of cicadas, and the soft, anxious huff of Midnight's breath. She opened the trailer. Midnight stepped down, nostrils flaring, eyes wide but determined. Madison glanced at the photo one more time. Yes, this was the place. A sagging roof lost beneath climbing vines, faded paint barely clinging to the warped wood. The hidden barn. "Come on, girl," Madison murmured, and Midnight followed at her side, picking their way through the tangled undergrowth. The path was muddy, strewn with old hoofprints and the marks of something heavy dragged across the earth. Madison's skin prickled. This wasn't just an abandoned outbuilding. Someone had been here recently. Every few steps, Midnight paused, looking back at Madison, as if urging her onward and warning her in the same moment. The bond between them, grown from grief, solidified by that night in the cemetery, felt like a living thing, thrumming with shared fear and determination. The barn loomed before them, doors hanging crooked on their hinges. Madison's heart pounded as she reached for the latch, hand trembling. She paused, feeling the memory of her mother's voice, steady, calm, reminding her that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but moving forward anyway. Madison pressed on. Inside, the barn was chaos. Hay was scattered everywhere, feed sacks slashed open, and tools lay in odd places, as if someone had been searching or fighting. The sweet scent of grain mixed with something darker, the metallic tang of old blood. Madison's eyes adjusted to the gloom. On the far side, near the tack room, she saw the battered shape of Walter's old hat, half buried under straw, the brim caked with mud. She knelt and picked it up, heart thumping. The hat was stained and battered, but the initials inside, WY, were unmistakable. Something bad had happened here. Midnight snorted, dancing sideways as Madison explored further. The mare stopped at a pile of broken boards, pawing the ground, nostrils quivering. Madison moved to her side, brushing away hay and straw. She found scuffed boot prints, a dropped flashlight, and the remnants of a rope. Frayed, stained and cut, not untied. Suddenly, memory crashed over Madison. She hadn't set foot in these woods since she was a teenager, the day her mother vanished. She'd always avoided this stretch of forest, haunted by nightmares of being lost, of calling out, and hearing only the wind. Now, the weight of those years pressed down on her. She could almost hear her mother's voice, urging her not to turn back. She pressed on, opening the tack room. The light from her phone played across the walls. Scraped paint, a dent in the old wood, an overturned bucket, signs of a struggle. Something had happened here, and not long ago. Madison's hands shook as she picked up a rag doll from the floor, an old gift for one of the horses, now trampled and torn. She checked every stall, every corner, heart thundering in her chest. Then she saw it, a smear of blood on the door, just below the latch, and a set of muddy footprints leading out the back. "Walter," she whispered, "you fought back." Midnight pressed close, her body heat a comfort against the chill. Madison followed the tracks through the back door, out into the tangled woods. The trail twisted through cedars and brambles, growing faint, then strong again. Every shadow felt alive. Every snap of a twig made Madison's nerves sing. Her grief for her mother, never fully healed, rose like a tide, mingling with new fear for Walter and new resolve. The trail ended at a patch of churned earth, tire marks pressed deep into the mud. Madison crouched, brushing away leaves, finding more rope, more evidence of a hurried departure. She snapped photos, her mind racing. Walter had been here, taken by force, maybe even alive. Midnight nudged her, breath hot, eyes shining with urgency. Madison hugged the mare's neck, whispering thanks for the courage she lent. "We'll find him," she promised. "I swear to you, we'll find him." As she turned to leave, Madison realized something had shifted inside her. The terror and grief that had paralyzed her for so long, since her mother's disappearance, since the first stormy night with the horses, was no longer just a weight. Now it was fuel. She would not run from the dark, not anymore. Back at the trailer, Madison loaded Midnight. Her hands steadier than before, she called the sheriff, told him everything she'd found. As the sun set behind the cedars, she drove back toward Cedar Ridge, a plan forming in her mind. She knew the next step: follow the trail, trust the horses, and never stop searching for the truth. Walter's secret barn had given her clues, and more than that, it had given her back her courage. The bond between her and Midnight was stronger than words. Together they would face whatever darkness remained. The road home was long, but for the first time Madison felt hope flicker through the fear. She was not alone in this fight. And somewhere Walter was waiting. Thunder echoed over Cedar Ridge as night fell, thick clouds blotting out the moon. In the aftermath of her discovery at the hidden barn, Madison Lane drove back into town with Midnight in the trailer, her mind a tangle of dread and adrenaline. She called the sheriff, but his polite assurances did nothing to calm her racing thoughts. He would look into it in the morning. Madison knew, with a gut certainty honed from years of loss and hard-won trust, that waiting was not an option. Somewhere Walter was still alive, and the horses were her only real guides. By the time she reached the rescue, Copper and Pearl were anxious and agitated, pacing the paddock and calling for Midnight. Madison quickly checked them, then hurried inside to change into dry clothes. No sooner had she pulled on a fresh shirt than she heard it. A frantic whinny outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of a horse bolting. Madison ran to the window just in time to see Midnight crashing through the gate, her black mane streaming, eyes wild and purposeful. Copper and Pearl followed, their bodies moving as one. This was no panic. This was a determined charge. Madison grabbed her jacket and pistol, heart pounding. She swung onto the old ATV she kept for emergencies and followed, headlights slicing through the night. The horses tore down the back road, veering toward the industrial district on the edge of Cedar Ridge, a cluster of old warehouses long abandoned except by those who preferred darkness to daylight. The rain returned, heavy and cold, as Madison trailed the horses to a sprawling, rust-stained warehouse. Midnight stopped at the front, pawing the ground, her body tense and ears flicking. Copper and Pearl stood behind her, flanking the entrance, as if guarding it. Madison's hands shook as she dialed the sheriff one more time. Voicemail. With no time to wait, she drew her pistol, checked the chamber, and approached the entrance, trusting the horse's instincts more than her own fear. The warehouse was silent, except for the drum of rain on the roof and the distant hum of machinery. Madison moved quietly, flashlight sweeping across stacks of old crates, the scent of oil and rust heavy in the air. Shadows loomed and retreated with every step. Inside, a voice barked, "Who's there?" Madison ducked behind a crate, heart hammering in her throat. She recognized the voice. Simon Brooks, a petty criminal known for rustling livestock and running schemes in town. She peeked around the corner and saw him, flanked by two rough-looking men, all eyes glinting in the gloom. Behind them, in a back office barely visible through a cracked door, Madison caught a glimpse of a slumped figure. Walter, bound to a chair, his head hanging, alive but unmoving. Midnight let out a piercing scream that echoed through the warehouse. Simon's men spun, startled, one raising a pistol. In that instant, Midnight charged, hooves pounding against concrete, her massive form a force of nature. The nearest man tried to aim, but Midnight knocked his weapon away with a violent kick, sending it skittering into the shadows. Copper and Pearl moved with uncanny intelligence. Copper positioned himself in the narrow hall, blocking any escape, while Pearl darted around crates, her shrill cries distracting the remaining thug. Simon cursed, grabbing Walter and dragging him toward the far door. Madison stepped into the open, gun raised. "Stop! Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Department! Drop him and let's end this now!" Simon sneered, desperation flashing in his eyes. "You don't scare me, deputy. This old man's worth more to me than you'll ever be." Walter groaned, trying to lift his head. Midnight lunged again, slamming into Simon's side and forcing him to release Walter, who tumbled to the floor with a cry. The thugs closed in, but Copper bared his teeth, driving them back, while Pearl blocked the hallway, whinnying and kicking at anything that moved. Adrenaline roared in Madison's ears. She darted forward, holstering her gun long enough to cut Walter's bonds. "Walter, can you stand?" she asked, gripping his shoulders. Walter blinked, dazed but lucid. "Thought I was a goner," he rasped. They want the horses, Madison. They faked my death, forged the paperwork, wanted to sell him overseas, said no one would come looking once I was gone." "I know," Madison whispered, fury boiling in her chest. "But you're safe now, I promise." The standoff spiraled into chaos as Simon lunged for his dropped gun. Before he could reach it, Midnight barreled between him and the weapon, forcing him to stumble backward into Copper's waiting kick, sending Simon crashing into a pile of boxes. Police sirens finally wailed in the distance, drawing closer. But the fight wasn't finished. Madison helped Walter to his feet, half carrying him out of the office. The horses kept a tight perimeter, never letting the thugs escape. Simon, bruised and battered, tried to make a break for the loading dock, but Pearl blocked his way, shrieking and rearing until he dropped to his knees in surrender. The warehouse doors burst open as police stormed in, weapons drawn. Madison raised her hands, calling out, "Deputy Lane, Suspects disarmed! Victim secured! The officers swarmed in, cuffing Simon and his men. One officer whistled low, staring at the 3 horses standing sentinel among the wreckage. In the aftermath, as Walter was bundled into an ambulance, he squeezed Madison's hand. "I knew you'd find me," he whispered, tears glinting in his eyes. "It was the horses. They wouldn't let me go, wouldn't let them win, just like they saved me in that blizzard years ago." Midnight Copper and Pearl gathered around him, nuzzling his hands, pressing their heads against his chest. Madison, overcome, knelt beside them, arms around their necks. For a long moment, they remained like that, a tangle of battered bodies and boundless loyalty, proof that even in the darkest hours, some bonds could never be broken. Simon was led away in cuffs, still cursing. The townsfolk who'd gathered outside staring in shock and awe. The truth spread quickly. Walter Young was alive, the horses were heroes, and the worst villains in Cedar Ridge were finally unmasked. Madison stood in the pouring rain, head tilted back, letting the cold wash away fear and grief. The warehouse, once a place of secrets and danger, now echoed with the hoofbeats of justice and the promise of healing. But even as the blue lights faded and the town began to breathe again, Madison knew the hardest part was not the fight. It was the aftermath, healing, trust, and rebuilding. But with Walter, the horses, and the truth finally in the open, maybe, just maybe, Cedar Ridge could begin again. Cedar Ridge awoke to the kind of dawn that seemed to wash away all the storms that came before it. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the town blanketed in the shimmering gold of morning sun. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter, as if the weight of secrets had finally been lifted. Yet for Madison Lane, the day brought its own heaviness, a cocktail of exhaustion, relief, and the anxious anticipation of what would happen next. The rescue stables buzzed with activity. News of Walter Young's rescue and the dramatic warehouse standoff had spread across town overnight. Police cars still idled out front. Local news crews clustered near the gates, their cameras pointed at the battered horses and their battered but unbroken owner. Madison had barely slept. She spent the dawn hours checking on Midnight, Copper, and Pearl, cleaning their wounds, speaking in soft tones that were as much comfort for herself as for them. Walter, pale and weak but alive, sat on a bench outside the barn, wrapped in a heavy blanket, sipping coffee from a thermos. He wore new bruises, a split lip, and a haunted look in his eyes. But his first request upon being released from the hospital was to see his horses. The reunion was quiet, private, almost sacred. Madison watched as Midnight pressed her broad head into Walter's chest, her nostrils quivering, Copper and Pearl circling in close, as if to shield him from the world. Walter closed his eyes and let his hands rest on their necks, breathing in the scent of sweat and hay. "You saved me," he whispered. "All of you." His voice broke, but he smiled, a true smile, for the first time in years. Madison sat beside him, arms wrapped around her knees, the last days playing over and over in her mind. She thought of the night at the cemetery, the desperate digging, the barn in the woods, the chaos of the warehouse, and of how it had all started with 3 horses who refused to give up. Police officers moved in and out, carrying boxes of evidence from the warehouse, ledgers showing the sale of stolen livestock, fake IDs, forged death certificates, and a phone that linked Simon Brooks to buyers overseas. It was enough not only to clear Walter's name but to expose a town-wide web of theft and corruption. Simon and his men were booked on a long list of charges, and word was that more arrests would come. Walter's estranged family, who had fought so hard for his property and assets, slunk away in the chaos, their claims in tatters. The will Madison had discovered in Walter's effects was now in the hands of the sheriff and the county judge. Its terms were clear. Everything, from the land to the last penny, belonged to Midnight, Copper, and Pearl under the stewardship of Madison Lane. The judge, a lifelong horseman himself, smiled as he signed the order. "Sometimes justice looks like a horse with a muddy mane and a stubborn heart," he said. For a few quiet minutes, Madison and Walter sat in the shadow of the barn, saying nothing. The horses grazed nearby, never straying far. Finally, Madison spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I kept thinking I was chasing ghosts, but all along it was just loyalty, love that wouldn't let go." Walter nodded, fingers trailing through Midnight's mane. "Grief makes us do strange things, Maddie. Sometimes it closes us off, but sometimes it brings us right back to the people and animals we need most." He squeezed her shoulder, a silent thanks for everything she'd risked. Madison closed her eyes and let herself breathe, really breathe, for the first time in days. For so long, her own grief had felt like a prison, her mother's memory locked behind a door she was too afraid to open. But this, watching Walter reunited with his horses, feeling their trust and forgiveness, showed her the way forward. She wasn't alone. She never had been. The aftermath of the scandal rocked Cedar Ridge. Old resentments resurfaced. But something else did too. Compassion. When the full story came out, the horses' midnight vigil, the empty grave, the warehouse rescue, something shifted in the town's heart. Neighbors showed up at the rescue, bringing feed, blankets, and their own stories of loss and healing. A few even filled out adoption forms, their eyes lingering on the horses, as if seeing them for the first time. That afternoon, Madison walked the grounds with Walter, showing him the repairs that needed to be made. "We can turn this place into something more," she said. "A sanctuary, not just for horses, but for anyone who's lost something, or someone they can't get back." Walter smiled, the idea lighting up his bruised face. As the sun dipped low, turning the sky the color of embers, Madison sat on a bale of hay, her hands resting on Midnight's withers. The barn was quieter now, the chaos of the last days finally giving way to peace. Copper and Pearl dozed in the paddock, safe and together. Walter joined her, sipping another cup of coffee. "They say animals don't grieve the way we do," he said, voice low. "But they know. They know about loss, about waiting, about never giving up." Madison nodded, stroking Midnight's soft coat. "And maybe that's why they can teach us how to heal. One step at a time." They sat in silence as dusk fell, letting the quiet wrap around them. In that gentle darkness, Madison felt something she hadn't in years, a sense that the worst was over, that the shadows really could lift, that tomorrow would come and it would be good. And outside the barn, beneath the first bright stars, Midnight, Copper, and Pearl grazed peacefully. No longer mourners, but a living testament to the power of loyalty, courage, and the bonds that outlast even the longest night. A gentle warmth settled over Cedar Ridge in the days that followed the warehouse rescue and Walter's dramatic return. The town, once so heavy with suspicion and secrets, now thrummed with new energy, a quiet hopefulness born from the ashes of chaos. At the center of it all stood Walter's ranch, transformed almost overnight from a place of whispered rumors and locked gates into a sanctuary for the lost and the longing. Walter himself had traded his hospital blanket for a battered flannel shirt and a faded ball cap. His steps were slow, and the bruises hadn't yet faded from his face, but his eyes were brighter, his voice surer. Each morning, he greeted the horses with a smile and a handful of carrots. leaning his weight against Midnight's sturdy side as he looked over the rolling pastures. Madison Lane became a near-constant presence at the ranch. The rescue's operations shifted there as well, the two worlds merging. Stalls that once sat empty now echoed with the soft nickers and shuffling hooves of new arrivals, abandoned, neglected, or grieving horses whose owners could no longer care for them. Some came with stories nearly as tragic as Midnight's or Copper's. Others simply needed a gentle hand and a safe place to rest. People started coming too. At first they arrived quietly. Curious townsfolk who'd heard the stories, parents with children in tow, old-timers with weathered faces and watery eyes. Then came the grieving, the newly widowed, the lonely, the heartsick, drawn not just by the tale of Walter's miraculous return, but by something deeper and harder to name. They came for hope. It was on a golden Saturday afternoon that Madison found herself sitting at a picnic table near the paddock, sipping strong coffee with Walter as they watched the horses graze. The sun painted everything in soft gold, and the air carried the sweet smell of cut hay and the distant laughter of children playing near the barn. Walter broke the silence first. "You know, there were days, especially when I was tied up in that warehouse, when I thought this was the end for me. I thought maybe I deserved it, for pushing people away so long. But those horses, they never gave up, not on me, not even when it hurt." Madison nodded, her hands curled around her mug. "They teach us, don't they? Not just about loyalty, but about showing up, even when it's hard, even when it feels pointless." Walter's eyes glistened. "I spent my whole life thinking strength meant standing alone. But it's not. It's letting others stand with you. Trusting that love, real, stubborn love, doesn't just survive loss. It transforms it." They watched as Midnight strolled over, her head dipping to rest in Madison's lap. For a long moment, Madison simply ran her fingers through the mare's mane, feeling the steady thump of her heart, the solid warmth that had anchored her through storms of grief. "You know," Madison said softly, "I used to think I was broken, that losing my mom was a wound I'd never get over. But sitting here with all of you, I don't feel broken. I feel lucky. Lucky to have known love deep enough to hurt." Walter smiled. "That's the trick of it, isn't it? Grief doesn't vanish. But if you let it, it becomes something else. A bridge, maybe. A way to find each other." Throughout the afternoon, visitors came and went. A young boy with a speech impediment bonded with a shy paint mare, brushing her coat with focused tenderness. An elderly woman from town spent an hour with Copper, tears running down her cheeks as she whispered stories from her childhood. Even old Mrs. Hollis, the town's perennial cynic, could be seen in the pasture feeding pearl apple slices and muttering that, sometimes, horses know better than people. The ranch's new mission became clear. Not just a haven for animals, but for people too. Madison worked with Walter to set up programs for foster kids, grieving families, and anyone who needed the comfort of a gentle presence. Each session ended the same way: time with the horses, quiet reflection, and the chance to let pain out into the open where it could breathe. The story of Walter's return and the horses' devotion spread beyond Cedar Ridge. Newspapers ran features. A television crew came out to film a segment. Donations poured in from strangers moved by the tale of loyalty and redemption. Madison and Walter laughed about it at night, both a little awed by the world's hunger for proof that kindness could still triumph. But for Madison, the most profound changes were the quietest ones. She found herself healing in ways she hadn't expected. Late at night, when the barn was dark and the world was still, she'd sit with Midnight, sharing stories of her mother, letting the ache in her chest become something softer. She began to dream again, not of the past, but of a future with room for both love and loss, hurt and hope. Walter found peace as well. He opened up about the years he'd spent running from family, from forgiveness, even from himself. Sitting on the porch, he'd confess his regrets, the harsh words, the missed opportunities, the walls he'd built. Madison listened, and in the silence between them, something shifted. Forgiveness, slow, imperfect but real, began to take root. As the ranch flourished, the town of Cedar Ridge seemed to change too. Neighbors were a little kinder. Old wounds began to heal. Even the church, once nearly empty, filled with people seeking comfort, drawn by the example of 3 horses and the humans who loved them. One evening, Madison stood by the fence as the sun dipped low, painting the fields with fire. Midnight pressed close, copper and pearl grazing nearby. Madison reached out, stroking Midnight's cheek. "We made it, girl," she whispered. "We really did." She looked back toward the barn, where Walter was leading a group of children on a tour, his laughter echoing across the fields. For the first time in years, Madison felt entirely at home, not just in Cedar Ridge, but in her own skin. Deep lesson. Loyalty, she realized, wasn't just about staying. It was about acting, about risking everything for those you love, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. Grief, when shared and honored, became the seed of connection and courage. The horses had taught her that love never leaves us behind. It simply waits for us to find our way back. As the stars appeared and the last light faded, Madison knew the story wasn't just hers, or Walter's, or even the horses'. It belonged to everyone who'd ever loved and lost, and dared to love again. A full year passed since the night Cedar Ridge was torn open by thunder, betrayal, and the wild courage of 3 horses. The storms of that fateful week faded into memory, but their legacy echoed everywhere. The town, once divided by suspicion and loss, was now knit together by a deeper understanding of what it meant to stand by someone through the darkest hours. The morning of the memorial dawned cool and bright, sunlight spilling gold over fields that were once scarred by storms. In the heart of Cedar Ridge Cemetery, a new monument stood, a polished stone etched with the names Midnight, Copper, Pearl, and below them the words, "Loyalty heals, love endures." A handful of fresh flowers, tied with blue and green ribbons, leaned against its base. All of Cedar Ridge turned out for the dedication. Young and old, town leaders and farmhands, children and grandparents, everyone stood together, faces shining in the gentle morning light. Walter Young, recovered and standing tall, took the podium, his battered cowboy hat in hand, his once grizzled face lit up by a soft, unshakable smile. He began quietly, voice steady. "I'm not a man of many speeches, but when I look at this town, at these horses, at the people who stood by me and by each other when it mattered most, I'm reminded what real loyalty looks like. Not the kind that asks for payment or attention or reward, but the kind that carries you when you're too tired to walk alone." The crowd listened, some with tears shining in their eyes, as Walter continued. "We all lose something in this life. A person, a dream, sometimes even ourselves. And sometimes, the only way back is by holding on to each other, by listening when the world says it's time to give up. These horses, Midnight, Copper, Pearl, showed us that loyalty isn't a word, it's a choice. And it's a choice we make every day, if we're brave enough." When he finished, Madison Lane stepped forward, leading a small, trembling foal with a white blaze and wide, anxious eyes. The crowd murmured in recognition. This was the filly found wandering the edge of town after a late winter storm, orphaned, half-starved, and terrified of everyone. except, miraculously, midnight. Madison's voice was steady as she spoke. Not so long ago, I believed grief was something to hide, that if I kept my hurt locked up, maybe I'd stop feeling it. But midnight, Copper, and Pearl, and Walter, and all of you, showed me something better. That by sharing pain, we find hope. That loyalty and love, given freely, can heal what nothing else can. She knelt beside Midnight, who nuzzled the young foal, her touch gentle, reassuring. This little one has seen more loss than a creature her age should ever know. But she's not alone. None of us are. And if we can remember that, if we can show up for each other, two-legged or four, we can weather anything. Madison looked out at the faces gathered. Faces she now knew as neighbors, friends, even family. If you ever see someone lost or hurting, don't turn away. Stand by them. Offer a hand or a quiet moment, or just your company. You never know whose life you'll change. Sometimes, all it takes to save a soul is to stay by their side. As the ceremony ended, applause rose, not wild or raucous, but deep and genuine, a community's heart beating together. The crowd lingered, sharing memories of that wild night, of the horse's vigil, of Walter's rescue. Children played around the stone, tying their own ribbons to the fence while old Mrs. Hollis dabbed her eyes and declared, "Well, never thought I'd see the day when a town listened to its horses." Later, at the ranch, Walter and Madison welcomed the community for a celebration. The barns were decorated with garlands and photos of the horses through the years. Midnight rearing in the snow, Copper napping in the grass, Pearl giving a child a first taste of courage. Tables groaned with food, laughter and music spilled across the fields. Walter sat on the porch, watching children learn to brush Copper, parents walking with their little ones beside Pearl. The foal, a symbol of second chances, pranced around the paddock under Madison's watchful eye. Midnight stood by the gate, calm and steady, accepting pats and apples from everyone who came near. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Madison led a group of local teens on a tour of the new sanctuary. Some were kids from rough homes, others just struggling to find their place in the world. She showed them how to fill water troughs, how to talk to a frightened horse, how to be patient, how to trust. One boy, shy and awkward, asked, "Do you think animals really understand us?" Madison smiled, kneeling so she could look him in the eye. "I think they understand what matters: kindness, patience, forgiveness. Things we all need, whether we know it or not." The boy nodded, brushing Midnight's neck, and for a moment, the burden of his worry lifted. When night finally fell, the ranch glowed with lanterns and the gentle sound of horses breathing deep. Walter and Madison stood side by side, watching the herd graze. Midnight, Copper, Pearl, and now the young foal, their silhouettes peaceful against the starlit sky. Some mysteries are solved not by logic, but by loyalty, by the courage to love, to trust, and to hope. Bonds formed in darkness can become the light that guides us home. In a world marked by loss, what endures is the steadfast heart, the one that chooses day after day to stand by others, no matter the storm. Madison turned to the crowd, raising her voice for all to hear. "If you see a soul, two-legged or four, who's hurting, don't look away. Stand by them. It might just be the one thing that changes everything. Loyalty transforms lives. It brought us back to each other. It brought us home." As the last notes of laughter faded and the stars shone brighter, Midnight, Copper, Pearl, and the new foal grazed together, their story woven forever into the heart of Cedar Ridge. A story of healing, family, and the kind of hope that never leaves you behind.